talking about the Habitat Restoration Needs Phase 2. This is a report for the partnership expansion area. I don't know if you all, so the purpose of this is to present findings of climate impact and present the findings of the climate impacts analysis and the draft HRN Phase 2 report deliverables related to the HRN Phase 2 technical project. The connection to the comprehensive plan supports all fish, wildlife, habitat protection, and CCMP actions and activities. So with that, I'll get started here. So this is I don't know if you all, I'm sure many of you all remember, it'll be a little over a year ago that ESA and Doug Robeson and Chris Warren completed Phase 1 of the Habitat Restoration Needs Project. And this is Phase 2, which is not necessarily a series. This is a parallel process here where we're now applying the same analysis and study that was done in the main partnership study area, that when there was an expansion, we're just applying that to this new expanded area. However, because there's been a year of time and some lessons learned as well as some new data available, there are going to be some differences, as well as that we do actually have a different geography. So there are going to be a few differences that we're going to talk about. Again, my name is JSaarinen. I'm officially a senior GIS analyst with ESA, and this is right in my wheelhouse of work to do. I'll be giving this presentation to TAC, to the Citizens Advisory Committee meeting, and also the Management Advisories Committee meeting. So this is something that's going to be running through the management conference. With that, we can move to the next slide. So I just wanted to give a little background as to who Environmental Science is. We're a 100% employee-owned company. We're 50 years old as of 2019, so we're actually on our 51st year. I'm really proud to be working for this company because, for a lot of different things that are going on in the world today, that are dominating our news. One is that I feel incredibly safe in terms of the virus. I don't feel uncomfortable in any way, shape, or form, and that's not just being at home working in an office. But yesterday I was doing cruise sampling on a boat, and we're all in masks. We're all, we're being really cognizant about how we're passing gear back and forth to each other with using disinfectant. And this all comes from the top. This all comes from meetings and meetings of getting on the same page with safety. And this is a California company, so these are folks that are definitely caught up in the epicenter of the virus. So we take this COVID-19 very seriously with in terms of worker safety, in terms of how we're coming together. The second thing that's dominating our news is definitely some justice issues and equity issues that are going on, that we're seeing. Our company has a very active diversity company. We have inclusion meetings, we have seminars, so we're all actively engaged in a lot of this dialogue. And some of the things that are coming out of that is that we're developing internships and connections with historically underrepresented communities to bring them into the environmental world. So those are some of the things we can do. I encourage you all to go to our webpage. There's a lot of really neat news. I guess last week, there's a really great editorial by one of our scientists about the new NEPA modernization and what that means in terms of permitting infrastructure and putting together any sort of federal funds. So it's a nice place I'd say it's an informative place to see what's going on. There's the webpage. Thanks for that. Okay, so let's get through a little bit of front matter here on the Habitat Restoration Needs Project. So this is important. The vision of this is the vision for habitats in the partnership service area is a diverse environment of interconnected, healthy habitats that support natural processes and viable and resilient native plant and animal communities. That's the vision statement. And our goal with this project is to help towards this goal is to increase the acreages of native habitats in the partnership area, both strategically and opportunistically. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means here. Next slide here. Okay, so we're putting together numeric targets in this project. So these targets are for publicly owned preservation or conservation lands or private lands, so conservation easement. We're putting together two types of targets. These are management enhancement targets. So these are areas that have existing native habitats, such as this cypress swamp that you see here in the picture on the right. And we're also putting restoration targets. So these are areas on existing preserved lands that are not native. So these are areas that could benefit from restoration activities in their identified approximate habitat endpoints. Next slide, please. So the partner to targets are numeric opportunities. So these are opportunities, these are unprotected private lands with identified habitat value. So these are not in the public domain, they're not under conservation easement. And we're looking at native preservation conservation opportunities. So these are native lands on unprotected areas that have conservation value. And then the other one are non-native preservation conservation opportunities. And these are the same, except for they're on areas that have value, but they're not native. And the third one, and this is something we're going to be talking about, are reservation opportunities. So these are non-native areas susceptible to climate change. And in the first phase of HRN, this was specifically for sea level rise. And I'm going to talk to you about why that's a little different here in this phase 2. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a flow chart, and this is a visual framework for our study here, to where we start with things that we have and how we get to these targets and opportunities. So of course we start with the partnership area, and we're going to break it up into 3 things, and actually there's a 4th one, water. So we're looking at protected areas and we're looking at unprotected areas. We're looking at existing development. So these are areas that are not to be considered for habitat restoration or into targets or opportunities, and also water, which is the same thing. It's not open water areas or hydrologic projects such as the C34 reservoir are not areas that can undergo any sort of restoration. What we're doing is breaking up protected lands into native and non-native habitats. And then we're able to, from the native protected lands, we're able to identify the MET, the management enhancement targets. And then we're able to look at the non-native habitats, and we're looking at coastal and non-coastal. And in HRN2, we're not looking at coastal areas because it's not a coastal watershed. So we're just looking at non-coastal. So we'll have restoration targets. In the unprotected lands framework here, there are private lands, and we're identifying these private lands that have habitat value. So basically that are on wish lists for various folks. And then we have without identified habitat value. So the ones that have identified habitat value, these are where you have our opportunities. And depending on whether or not they're native or non-native is whether or not identifies the PCO. Next slide, please. Another really important part of this analysis is identifying the stratum. So this is the strata that are in the area are basically upland areas. So these are areas above 5 foot mean sea level, freshwater wetlands, and then coastal areas. These were areas that are below 5 feet mean sea level. And so again, I'm giving you some background on phase 1. So this is the partnership area before it expanded. And so you can see the breakup of how upland, which is shown in green, is worked with the freshwater wetlands, which are shown in the light blue, and the coastal. This is what the strata look like for the old service area that was done in HRN phase 1. And again, we're breaking these up into the targets and opportunities are identified by which stratum they belong in. Okay, next slide, please. These are the developed areas. So these are areas that have land uses that are residential or commercial or intensive agriculture. And the reason why they're excluded is because of one, of the purchase cost, and two, the restoration cost. So these are areas that are very difficult to bring back into the goal and the vision of the partnership. And again, these are residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation areas. Next slide, please. Okay, these are the results of phase one. Here you can see in this table, now hopefully I'm jogging your memory. You're able to see the targets and you're able to see the opportunities and their acreages listed by the strata. And if you want to dig more into these tables, you can access the report that's on the webpage. Next slide, please. Okay, so now that's the background. Let's talk a little bit about what the HRN2 phase 2 is, and really we're talking about the non-tidal or freshwater Caloosahatchee watershed. So this is the watershed that's above the Franklin Lock. So the Franklin Lock is, if you're not familiar with it, it's on the Caloosahatchee River, and this is what, well, one, regulates flows coming out of Lake Okeechobee, but two, another important process is keeping salt water out of this watershed. It's about 606,000 acres. All of it is in the South Florida Water Management District. And this last bullet is pretty important, and something that I've learned, I don't know if everybody on the call understands, is that it really comprises critically important unprotected Florida panther habitat. And I think we can jump to a webpage here that gives you an idea of, and so this is coming from a Nature Conservancy publication, and I really like the slider map. Is pay attention to, look where Lake Okeechobee is, and look where Fort Myers is, and where LaBelle is. And what you're going to see here is you're going to see this is the critical point of where connecting the southern panther habitat with the northern panther habitat. So all the areas in yellow, those are areas that have been, identified by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as areas that could be great, set aside for panther habitat, as well as the stuff on below LaBelle, south of LaBelle, and it's all crossing right here in this expansion area. So that footprint that you see in yellow, I know it's a different scale than what you're going to be seeing in the rest of the maps in the presentation. But what I'd really like you to do is to kind of remember that footprint. Remember this in terms of panther habitat. Remember what you're seeing here, and apply it to the different maps that I'm going to present here as we go along. You are going to have a chance when I show the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service their planned areas for protections. You're going to see this yellow come up again, but just remember this footprint. Thanks, Nicole, for bringing us out to that page. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's a better view. This is kind of the scale that we're going to be looking at this expansion area and the study that I've done. You could see the HRN1 there on the western side of the expansion area, and we're going to be tying into HRN1 with this analysis, with this study. Next slide, please. Okay, the first task was to understand how this area has changed in terms of the habitat status and trends, how this area has changed. So next slide. The purpose of this was to detail habitat change and gains and losses, establish current benchmarks of habitat acreages, reveal which habitats change significantly, and it's important to note that we're staying consistent with mapping and classification procedures and dataset products with HRN1. Next slide, please. So the methods of this task for this study is we extracted geospatial data sets, flux from SoftMud. We reclassified them to consistent habitat categories that were in HRN1, and we just simply summarized the acreages and compared them. And that's what you're going to see here in the next few slides. Go ahead. All right, so this is the 1995 soft mud land use for the habitat area. I'm going to show you these maps relatively quickly. I'd like to just say that you can look at them in detail in the report, and there is a web page, a web map that you can access to look at these as well. So let's not spend a lot of time looking at these individual things. Mostly, kind of get a big picture of what you're seeing, you know, in terms of habitat. I'll have some quantifiable tables at the end where you can compare. So here's 95. Go to the next slide, please. Here's 99. Next slide, please. Here's 2009. Next slide, please. And this is 2016. So it's important to note that in phase one, 2016 was not used. 2009 was used. So here's one of the main differences between phase two and phase one is that we're using 2016 land use from soft mud as opposed to 2009. Okay, next slide, please. This is the table, the quantifiable table where we've reclassified into these flux roll-up classes that were consistent with HRN phase one, and you can see the changes. So I think when I'm looking at this to talk a little bit about, you know, just to give a little discussion, is that you're going to see some changes. You're going to see where dry prairie is expanding. And you're going to see where upland coniferous forests are decreasing, where upland hardwood forests are staying relatively the same. Another really big drop is in the wetland coniferous forests. So it's going from the really big acreage in 95 going down to 24,000. So it's a big drop. There's also a drop in the hardwood forests as well. I'm sorry, So the wetland coniferous forest actually, there's some differences in the mapping going on in 6200. There's a big jump and increase, and then a steady decrease. So I think we're seeing some effects of the mapping and the classification that's going on between 95 and 99. And I think that's also that may not be happening so much in the hardwood forest, but it's happening in the coniferous forest. There's also a steady drop in the wetland vegetated non-forest as well. So the next slide here is land cover. And many of you, like maybe what I was when I first looked at this, is why is there differences in land use and land cover? And when you look at the soft mud flux data sets, there is a distinguish. They keep land use separate from land cover. Most times they're the same. So when you look at the level 4 land use, it's the same as the level 4 land cover. But in many cases, a significant number of cases, particularly in this area, in this watershed, the land use and the land cover are different. And so with that, you can see that the drop of hardwood forest, the trends are not as drastic. And then if you look in the next slide here, there's a comparison of the two tables where you have land cover and land use. So if you look at upland shrub and brushland, very different numbers. And you'll see that in the wetland coniferous forest, these are drastic. These are big number of changes. These are two different data sets. And if you look in the next slide, this is where I would ask you to look at the maps and look for where the differences are. And you'll see that particularly in the area around Lehigh Acres, this is in the southwestern portion of the study area, that there are differences in how land cover, which is on the left, is mapped compared to land use, which is on the right. And what's happening here, if you go to the next slide, is this is a Google Streets view of these areas in Lehigh Acres. I don't know if how many have actually had a chance to drive through these areas, but you have single family residential that is nestled in with native habitat. And so the classifiers that SoftMud did is that they found that the use was actually single family residential, but if you look at the dominant features on the landscape, it really represents the land cover type. In this case, you probably have a xeric like a xeric scrub. So I think this is why it's been hedged. We had a lot of discussion, and I think if you go to the next slide here, we had a lot of discussion about this at the Habitat Subcommittee meeting, and this is probably maybe the last in-person meeting that was able to be held that the partnership had. And it was funny. No one was shaking hands, and it was an interesting meeting that we had in LaBelle. Lehigh Acres was there, and we had a lot of folks that were stakeholders, and I think we spent a lot of time talking about this. And the conclusion was to use land use, to be used for setting targets and opportunities for habitat status and trends in HRN2. And the reason for it is because the ecological and economic costs associated with land use used for target and opportunity setting outweighs the habitat structure. And so that was the major recommendation coming out of the Habitat Subcommittee, and that's what I'm bringing to you all for consideration and for comment. I'd like to, a disclaimer is that in phase one, HRN1 uses 2009 soft mud land cover, and the parts that are in swift mud, the 2014, they do not distinguish between land use and land cover. And from what I can tell, there, in some of those areas, it's really land covers what swift mud is classing when there are, like, in areas where, so in areas in parts of Lehigh Acres that are in swift mud, they're using the land cover classes. So there's going to be a little difference right there at the study boundaries. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's move on to the second part. These are completed, ongoing, and planned. So this is where I'm documenting planned habitat restoration, conservation, and land acquisition projects here. And I'm going to show you different agencies' ideas of what this landscape is, what they would like it to look like. Move forward, please. The purpose is to document the coverage and extent of these restoration areas. This is a critical step for quantifying opportunities and targets. This is where we're using this information to guide us into the targets and opportunities. And stakeholder input is essential. Again, this information that I'm going to show you was also brought up at the Hicks meeting. That subcommittee was able to review and make comments on it. And so what I'm going to be presenting are results of that subcommittee meeting. Next slide, please. The sources for existing areas are the Florida Natural Areas Inventory. This is the go-to in the state for managed lands. I'm also looking at the Florida Forever acquired lands. So these are lands that have been acquired. I looked at the county level. I looked at Glades County zoning. I looked at their parks. I looked at Henry County. They have a conservation layer. Lee County has an excellent parks and preserves layer. With Kim Flykowski's help, I was able to look at the Lake Hickapachee Hydrologic Enhancement Project and also the West Coast Lands Project that they have. For proposed areas, I looked at Florida Forever projects. So these are areas that have not been acquired that are on the list. Another really important source are the CLIP priorities. So this is it's also run through FNA that University of Florida Center for Landscape Planning put together. This is the Critical Lands and Waters Identification Project. I looked at the first, second, and third priorities. The Glades County zoning. So Glades County was at the Hicks meeting, and we were able to talk about their conservation. I'm sorry, they weren't. No, we talked with Henry County. I looked at their zoning. I haven't updated. Henry County definitely has this. They have a say in the proposed areas. Glades County just has a GIS layer that I was able to access. Of course, I looked at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Panther focus areas. That's widely available. I looked at the Army Corps of Engineers Oxbow restoration. This came from Corey Anderson. Was able to look at those areas, and Lee County has their Conservation 2020 publicly available as well. So let's look at what these different areas look like on the map. So these are the existing conservation areas. These are areas that are already in the public domain. So what you'll see here is you'll see the Lake Hickapachi, you'll see the different conservation areas, whether or not they're federal areas, they're state areas, or if they're just local, meaning that they belong to a county or city. And then there's a couple of conservation easements that you can see that begin to form that corridor for panthers across the Caloosahatchee. And I think that a lot of that work is being done by the Nature Conservancy. Next slide, please. Here, now you're looking at the plant. These are the Florida Forever projects. So these are areas that are on the Florida Forever list. And again, you're starting to see that corridor. And a lot of these areas that are on that list are part of that corridor. Next slide, please. This is the planned area coming from the Glades County. So these are our conservation areas, primarily designated as wetlands that Glades County represents. Next slide, please. And here's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and you could tell they really have their eyes focused on this particular watershed. The dark brown area is currently primary habitat for Florida panthers, and that's why you're seeing a lot of existing areas within this. Now you can see that corridor that I first introduced in the Nature Conservancy slider map, that now you're going to begin to see, you're going to see that pattern as I go through these maps. That's the dispersal area. This is what's connecting the primary area with what they designate as the northern area. And then there's secondary habitat that extends from that. That's where they're wanting to connect it through that dispersal corridor. Next slide, please. And here's and no surprise, the CLIP identifies that immediately in its priority 1 model. So they're looking at that panther habitat. Again, the CLIP model is a composite of biodiversity and water, water purification and also water recharge. And they're calling this a priority 1 area for the panther resource. There's also priority 2 and priority 3 that go along with some of the other, that agree well with some of the other wish list areas as well. Next slide, please. And here's, you'll be able to see these little areas that are along the Caloosahatchee, but these are these Oxbow restoration areas that the Army Corps has their sets on them. They would like to restore the Oxbows primarily downstream of the C-43 reservoir. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about a task that was entered in kind of late. We had to go back and think about this part. As I've mentioned, this is a non-tidal watershed. It's a non-coastal watershed, and what the phase 1 has done in the past is they've looked at at how sea level rise is going to impact habitats, and whether or not these habitats have a chance to migrate and to adapt to rising sea levels to increase salinity in their areas. Go forward, please. Okay, so how do we begin to think about climate change impacts on a non-coastal watershed, an area that's not going to be affected by sea level rise? Because I think here in Florida, that's primarily what we think about, especially in coastal Florida. So what's going to happen in these non-coastal areas? What's going on? And so if you look at the report coming from CEQ, the Council of Environmental Quality, that is a report coming from the International Panel on Climate Change, is that in the Southeast and the Caribbean, the big issue is going to be decreased water availability. The main thing is that evapotranspiration is going to increase because it's going to be hotter, it's going to be warmer, the conditions are going to be right for less water availability on the landscape. That being said, there's going to be, there could be major fluctuations in precipitation, but precipitation is event-driven, whereas evapotranspiration is continuous. So if you have an increase in evapotranspiration, 10% say, and you also have an increase in precipitation, it's still going to be drying because the ET is continuous. I wanted to say that I'm collaborating with the University of South Florida, the Geosciences department. So there's two professors that have a consulting firm, Mark and Kai Rains, and they do a lot of work with the South Florida Water Management District, Everglades landscape model. And this is an approach that they've used with trying to understand how the Everglades may change. It's going to be a drying situation for areas that are not coastal. So along the coast, they see sea level rise, increasing salinity, but in areas that are not coastal, it's going to be a drying situation. And this is going to impact the vegetation and the habitats. So access to water is a competitive advantage, and habitats will attempt to migrate to optimal hydrologic conditions. So they're going to move where their roots are not reaching water. They're going to go to an area where their roots can be wet for as long as they need. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is, so one of the first things we did is fortunately, South Florida Water Management District has a lot of wells. And so what we did is we looked at all of their wells, and we were able to see how the wells are distributed. And most importantly, is that we picked this 18 inches of depth, and we found out how long things are going to be wet for at that 18 inches of depth. And this is the duration curve done with colors. And at 18 inches of depth, going from brown to blue, this is how long that area is wet, based on this well data. And you can see that you can almost see that there's a break right at the Caloosahatchee River, and the areas to the south are drier, meaning that the amount of time that 18 inches of depth are wet is less compared to the northern area. And I think this is a function of elevation. So areas to the north are lower, but also that you have more agriculture to the south, and particularly in those areas. So one of the things that we did is, in talking with Mark and Kai, is if the area is drying, then the amount of time that 18 inches of depth is going to be lower. So you're going to be decreasing the duration of wetness at 18 inches of depth. So if you look right in the center there, that's about 20% of time. So that 20% of time may become 18% of time, or 17% of time is 18 inches wet. And this is over, let me go back and say, this is over a 30-year period. So this is over 30 years. That's how long, that's the amount of time over 30 years that these areas are wet. So let's look at another piece of information, and that is the habitats. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I did is I was able to identify for all of these different habitat classes what their ranges are compared to that 18 inches of depth duration. So for all of these native habitats, and this is a big list, the habitats are along the rows. If you go along the columns, the y-axis, you're seeing the statistics for all the habitat areas, what these habitats like in terms of that 18-inch duration. So we'll look at the top row because it's easy to look at. This is a dry prairie. The minimum amount of time that a dry prairie wants that 18-inch wetness is 20%. However, its mean wetness is at 31%. but a standard deviation below that mean wetness is 24%. So really, you're looking at, it really does not, these habitats don't exist below 20%. They aren't on the landscape where the duration curve is below 20%. And they're really, the low part of the spectrum is at 24%. We're not so much, I'm kind of keying in on those two columns because things are getting drier. So how are things migrating in that dry area? Not so much in the wet area. So those wet columns, we're not thinking about things getting wetter, so they're not going to get drowned out. It's really, are they going to have availability of the water? So what we did is I was able to take that duration model that you saw in the last slide and compare it with these habitat ranges to show which habitats are going to become water stressed and whether or not these areas are going to drop below, these habitats are going to drop below what their lowest range of wetness, or if they're actually going to start going into that water stress area that exists below the minimum and a standard deviation below the mean. And that's some of the next maps I'm going to show you are going to represent that. So next slide, please. So these are what we did is we broke it up into scenarios. It's always looking into the future, and I think you'll see this with the most climate change. A really good way to approach this is with scenarios. And so the scenarios that I'm presenting to you are 2.5% dry, 5% dry, 7.5% dry, and 10% dry. So this is reducing that duration that you saw in the first slide that I presented by 2.5%, 5%, 7.5%, and 10%. So this is bringing that duration curve, and this is how those native habitats that are identified by their characteristics of duration, how they are going to respond based on the scenarios. And so what you're seeing in these maps are alternative futures based on the 4 scenarios, showing which native habitats are going to become endangered, or they're at 18 inches, the duration is going to drop below what they currently are experiencing. And then the threatened areas. So these are habitats that their duration is going to exist between the lowest and a standard deviation below the mean. And then the green areas are areas that are not going to be affected. These are native habitats that are not going to be that will not drop below their standard deviation below the mean. And so you could see from a 2.5% scenario that there's going to be some areas that are affected primarily in some native habitats that are going to be affected primarily in the dry area. That one well that you saw where it was dry and radiate out from there. As things become drier, as it goes from 2.5% to 5%, this endangered area grows, as well as the threatened area. The threatened area grows too, but primarily what you see is that as things become drier, the areas that are sort of water stressed, they drop below what they require, what they need in terms of a wetness. And that's what you're seeing. That's why the red area is growing, whereas the yellow area is actually being consumed by the red area. And in the next slide, you're going to see how I've quantified these areas based on each of these habitats. Next slide, please. So this is a pretty complex table that is going to be hard to understand just here in this presentation, but it's in the draft report that is available to you all for your examination. Mostly want to introduce it to you. So these are the classifications the same classifications that we saw in the trends analysis, and their current acreages. And then what you're seeing are two big columns. That's the endangered and the threatened, and the sub columns within there are those scenarios. So this is the 2.5%, the 5% scenario, the 7.5%, the 10% scenario. And these are the acreages of each of these native habitats that are going to be endangered and threatened. And you could see it grows just like you saw visually in the map. You could see that the addition of the endangered plus the threatening grows. You could definitely see how the endangered grows. The threatened, that's going to actually shrink because some of those areas are going to become, they're going to go from threatened to endangered. So I think I would like to point out the wetland coniferous forests are again under the microscope. We're not just talking about conversion from land use, from the habitats trends, but we're also looking at it from the past. You can see that it's changed, but now as we bring the crystal ball that we've made for right now, and you look in the future, you can see that 6,200 line there, wetland coniferous forests. You can see that how those numbers are going from 11% to 46% endangered. So that's an area to really be focused on, to be thinking about that type of habitat. Next slide, please. So how is all this coming together? This is the additive hybrid model. This is that really nice blue and green model, blue, green, and red model, showing the targets and the opportunities. And that's what I'm going to present here. Good, next slide. So here, this is existing development. These are the red areas. These are the areas that are not we can't include in the targets and opportunities because it's just too expensive to handle. Next slide, please. These are the areas these are the green series. So these are the management enhancement targets and the restoration targets. So these are the light green areas are the native areas that are in existing conservation, and the dark green are the non-native areas that are in existing conservation. Next slide, please. These are the blue series. These are the opportunities. So the light blue are the native preservation. So these are areas that are native habitat that are on lists, and the dark blue are non-native areas that are on lists. So non-native PCO and native PCO. Next slide, please. This is the water. So these are areas that can't be restored. So it's basically a mask. And then the next slide. This is the combined surface. So this is the last thing that you haven't seen before. These are areas not considered. So these are non-native areas that are not on a list. That's what you're seeing in gray. But other than that, every acre is accounted for in the study area. That's either in one of these classes. It's either a target, an opportunity, it's a development, water, or it's just an area that's not considered. And you'll see the breakdown if you go to the next slide. These are I was talking about the strata, the freshwater wetland and the upland strata. And so this is how it breaks down. What you aren't seeing is the yellow areas. You're not seeing the coastal strata. The areas that you see are gray are water or existing development. So go to the next slide, please. And this is where you have the breakdown. So this is where you see almost 50,000 acres are developed. But what's good is that you have an equal amount that's already protected. So that's good. You're at that balance of half and half in terms of what's protected, but there's a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of great opportunities for restoration and also for purchasing. So you can actually switch the balance around. So we're not just talking about half and half. We're talking about a much more habitat in the watershed than what's developed and unrestorable. There's a good amount that doesn't have value. Probably these are agricultural fields or rangelands. There's also a significant amount of water in this project area. And then you can see the breakdown in the strata down in acreage, the acreages in the strata down below. Next slide, please. Okay, so to conclude, there's a lot of information here to be considered. This study has brought out a lot of information, and it's hard to really say what is one conclusion. You can look and see at how the habitats have changed over time in the study area. You have to take that with a grain of salt because we're using different mapping efforts and mapping information. So definitely you need a critical eye when you're looking at that habitat status and trends. And I would recommend making sure you're comparing apples to apples. And what you're seeing mostly is when you're looking at the later time series, that's a more consistent mapping effort. That we're looking at existing preservation and conservation lands. We're looking at areas that are already in the public domain, that you're already working with public partners on how to turn that into habitat and what to do. And then where you're looking to people more like the Nature Conservancy and folks that are reaching out to try and bring private land into public domain, either through purchasing or through a conservation easement. We show proposed land acquisition priorities. I think a really important thing here is the panther aspect, just because it is such a critical linchpin. All those habitats are very important. And then also here, I'm showing you habitats that are at risk for climate change with the drying component. So these are my main conclusions from the study. Next slide, please. So let's get into some discussion. I'd like to bring out some questions here that I have to start, just to seed it, although I'm sure there are many that you all have on your own that we can use some time here to talk about. I got an early start, but I think if we have, maybe we'll end early, but we do have some time to talk. The first questions I have for you, if we go to the next slide, is that there was that reservation opportunity category that was presented in HARN phase 1, and these were coastal areas that were susceptible to climate change. And the reason why they were called reservation is that you needed these areas to let habitats migrate. The question I have for the TAC, and that I'm still kicking around, is that how do we repurpose the reservation areas for the climate change study that we prepared for HARN phase 2. The second question is, are we handling agriculture correctly? And some discussions I've had with FDACs is when they're looking at our categories for that can be restored, they have some questions about that, because this is these are producers for them. These are areas that are not likely to go into conservation or preservation anytime soon. So the question is, are we handling agriculture correctly? And I'm really interested in hearing some of your thoughts on that. And the last one, and again, I'm gonna hit on this one because it's really stand out, is that how can we translate the study into protected habitat for critical species like the Florida panther? And with that, next slide. Just like to thank you very much for your attention and for your ears, and I'll open it up for questions, comments, and please, I guess I'll put my chair hat on. Just unmute yourself, say your name, and come on in. I think if we're getting a lot of things all at the same time, we might need to go to a raise hand format. But other than that, thank you so much.
Justin, this is Amanda. Thank you so much for the presentation. I was just wondering if we could go back to the last slide so we could have those 3 questions up while we discuss.
Yep.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is Jennifer, Justin. I can't raise my hand because I'm hosting this, but I would like to throw out just some thoughts on these questions. As far as agriculture, having worked on the Florida Panther policy for many years with regards to the Endangered Species Act, a lot of the recovery areas for the Florida panther that have been designated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are agricultural lands, not necessarily always to be restored, but to at least be pursued for potential easement to prevent further intensification, because panthers are very compatible with using agricultural properties in their current state. So I think there was a lot of care taken in making sure that we identified those as preservation conservation opportunities, with the understanding that, number one, that they're all opportunities based on willing sellers, and number two, that preservation, conservation, there's a whole spectrum of options, including easements. So just, I think it's important for people to be aware of that. We're not necessarily saying that all those need to be publicly acquired or restored, but we are saying that those are areas that we should seek ways to incentivize landowners to not further intensify or convert those to developed areas where that would become incompatible with panther recovery. And then as far as climate change, this is probably the most difficult question that I really would like to hear the TAC's opinion on, is just, you know, with the great work you've done on the climate change, trying to figure out how to identify areas for habitat migration opportunities inland. You know, how do we translate that? Do we identify all those as reservation opportunities? Again, we were careful to use the word opportunities, not targets, to indicate that these are just areas of additional focus, but not necessarily something that we're definitively saying you have to go reserve. But nonetheless, I wanted to hear also the TAC's opinion on that, because I think that's going to weigh into the final report and whether we add those into the totals for that reservation opportunity category. Thank you.
Hey Jennifer, thank you. I just want to talk on the ag part. There was I've had some discussion with FDACs, and I think Jess Stempion's on about they have a lot of different BMPs that can be put on as a whole BMP manual for agricultural lands, and there's a wildlife BMP, and so that's something that I think you were sort of getting to, and might need to be considered here to talk about how that works. I don't know if Jess wants to talk a little bit more about it, if she's online or not.
I'm online. Thanks for bringing it up. Yeah, the wildlife BMP manual covers some of the protected species, but it doesn't cover panthers. So, you know, maybe at some point we can come back and do a presentation about how it does work, if the TAC would like that, and then that would probably help with the discussion.
Great. Yeah, thank you. I think that's where I brought that question up.
Yeah, and Jeff, we would love to have that presentation. Unfortunately, because it doesn't.
You're on mute.
I just wanted to say, Jess, thank you for that. And we would definitely like to take you up on your offer to do that presentation. However, as you pointed out, since it doesn't cover the panther, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to resolve this issue. And this report basically is now in its finalization stage. We hope to have it finalized by the end of this cycle. So really, we need any input that TAC members have, we need it now so we can fold it in as we prepare the final draft to take to policy for approval. I do see a comment in the chat box. I'm going to read it off. It's from Greg Blanchard, who is having some audio issues. He says, the climate change predictions on the study seemed rooted in the Southeast U.S. Caribbean climate change predictions. Have you done any sensitivity analyses of the predicted environmental changes versus changes, updates in the Southeast U.S. Caribbean values? So I guess that question is posed to you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. That's a really good question. No, the answer is no. I'm really leaning on the eco-hydrology experts that I'm consulting with on this, and you know, this is really the only thing we can hang our hat on, and unfortunately, we don't have the scope to get into a sensitivity. I think if we were to sharpen our pencils, we could look at how climate is really changing. It's really interesting that this part of Southwest Florida is actually in a different climatic zone than the Southeast Florida and the Caribbean. And the main difference of that climatic zone is that it's drier in the Southwest than it is the Southeast. So to be honest with you, I think we're conservative by talking about drying at these levels. I think we're going to see much drier, and this is going into long discussions. I think, Jennifer, we should probably. I wish that Mark and Kai were on this call. They could talk a little bit more about it. But I think they've done a lot of study on this, and I think it would be good to bring the TAC to talk a little bit about the inland climate change impacts in Southwest Florida, particularly in your service area. Is there any more discussion? Any more contact? I'm hoping that I covered the plans for the Panther adequately.
Hey Justin, this is Devin. I've got a quick question. Maybe this is looking more next steps on this project, but talking about the how are you handling agriculture correctly? I was wondering if the climate change modeling, does that incorporate upper Florida and aquifer drawdown or anything like that, rising from increased agriculture?
Thanks for bringing that up. So I think implicitly the duration, the groundwater duration that you see, I think part of the reason for why that's modeled the way it is because of agricultural withdrawals. And I think all of us in our mind, we can understand that as the landscape becomes drier, that there's going to be more pressure on the upper Floridan for for producers to irrigate their crops. So there's a lot of components that are built into this. And really, the way that I put together the scenarios of the 2.5 to 10% are just thinking about a 7% increase in evapotranspiration that was done by Flowers et al. And a 10% swing either way of precipitation. So that led me to the 2.5% to 10% drawdown. I think between ET, between pumping, between droughts, lack of rainfall and recharge, I think that's all going to go into somewhere in between that 2.5 and 10. Where it lands, that's just so difficult to do. That's why we have the scenarios.
Justin, this is Amanda Kahn again. I know the focus shifted to a lot of the Florida Panther because of that vital corridor. But, I think it's also important to just focus on, protecting and making sure we reestablish just the variety of habitat and the gradients of habitat and the ecotones of habitat. So, one thing I noted, aside from, I know there were differences in the land uses versus land cover. Do you know those discrepancies were also there when it came to some of the wetland habitats? I noticed there were great differences as well. And one of the things that really struck me between that 95 to like 2009 or 2012 or 2016 was the loss in streams and water, and then as well the wetlands. And so, those are imperative for providing any sort of buffer for, nutrients or toxins. Just the more wetlands we lose, so how do you see, also helping that into the plan and making sure, those, that we don't just go into just endangered species, but we also recognize this, making sure we have ecotones and habitats.
You're right at the heart of the vision that I presented in the first slide and the goal, and it's interconnected habitats, and that includes the habitats and everything in between where you have those ecotones that you're talking about and all the services that are associated with that. So again, I really would like you to take the 95 to 2016 trends with a grain of salt. And I think there's none more, not a better example than looking at the water classifications that were done. I think there's just a major differences in the mapping. That's our window into the past, is how the mapping was done. You'll see that the water is a little bit more consistent, you know, in the later studies. There is, you're right, we do need to include the focus of how those things are changed. The differences in the land cover and land use in the wetlands are that there are land uses in wetlands. And if you drive through Lehigh Acres, you'll see that there are single family residential areas. These are privately owned parcels that have houses on them that are right next to cabbage palm wetlands, and that are really, so that's how they've been classified. And take a look. I encourage you to take a look at those maps that are in the report, and the web resources available, so you can really scale in and see what's going on there. It's a hard call to make. You know, it really was. I was recommending land cover, and I think we were all on it. But it's, you know, you talk to the stakeholders, you talk to Lehigh Acres, and they don't intend on people that own houses to be switched over to targets.
Can I add a few thoughts on that? Amanda, I think that's a really good point, and we definitely captured a lot of the wetlands. Where wetlands had become so fragmented and were embedded within like residential community, like, you know, large scale pre-platted communities like Lehigh Acres. Basically, we also made a decision that really this is a habitat restoration needs focused, you know, on a large landscape scale, looking at trying to build contiguous connective corridors and habitat areas. And that we made a point then in the report to say that just because we excluded those other areas that might be more fragmented, that there doesn't mean that there aren't some smaller scale habitat conservation, restoration opportunities, or that also that this is, because it's habitat focused, not focused on hydrological restoration or water resource protection initiatives. So this is really just a slice of the whole pie of what needs to go on to restore all natural resources. And so we wanted to make sure that that was really clearly articulated in the full report. So I don't know if that helps address your concerns, but we were aware of that, and we did try to make sure to emphasize that point.
Yes, thank y'all for that.
Well, I guess I would just interject that also, that if there are any comments, if you guys can take a deeper dive, look at these maps and see if you see anything that doesn't look right to you or you have questions about, please don't hesitate to reach out to Justin, Nicole, or myself. We are trying to make some final edits, and we want to make sure that this is the strongest final product that goes to policy this cycle as possible. So, you know, just let us know after this meeting if anything comes to you that you think would be pertinent in helping us do that. Thank you.
On that note, Jennifer, I just wanted to mention the updated report again is on the TAC page. So make sure everybody to check that out for your comments.
One last thing that I wanted to bring up is there's a really incredible photograph that of the Caloosahatchee that Carlton Ward Jr. took, and I guess he did it for the Nature Conservancy. And I think it would be really fantastic to include that photograph in some of this material. However, I don't feel comfortable. It's not licensed for any sort of public use. If anybody has a connection to Carl Ward Jr. Or can reach out to him, this is my ask of the TAC to use that photograph. I'd be grateful. I think it would greatly enhance just the glossiness of the study. and the glossiness of the expansion area. So with that, thank you very much.